Hello and welcome to this presentation on behalf of Celebrating Age Wiltshire. My name is Laurence and some of you might recognise me from a concert I recorded for Celebrating Age Wiltshire back in February with my wife Sian on violin and my mother Helen on piano. I was playing the French horn that day. Today, however, I am instrument free and would like to talk to you about my other passion, the Wiltshire landscape and particularly the extraordinary archaeology we have in this amazing county of ours. I grew up in Marlborough and from an early age was fascinated by the standing stones of Avebury and West Kennet Avenue, the ancient tomb of West Kennet Longbarrow, and the lumps and bumps of the burial mounds that are found throughout the area. When I was 14, I walked the Ridgeway from West Overton near Avebury to Streatley on the Thames with my father, who taught the violin at Marlborough College. I wrote a school project on the experience, paying particular attention to all the ancient sites we encountered along the way, including the Avebury region and the Iron Age hill forts of Barbary, Liddington and Uffington Castle with its lovely white horse. A long time has passed since then, but two things haven't changed. I still love long-distance walking projects and still have a passion for the archaeology and countryside of Wiltshire. In fact, I now have my own little company called Oldbury Tours, through which I take people to the prehistoric sites of Wiltshire in particular, although I do usually include plenty of other places of interest as well. After all, this is a wonderful county to show off. I now live in Carn, 14 miles west of Marlborough, and during the first lockdown in 2020, made a number of circular walks from my house into the countryside, including a midsummer solstice walk to Avebury for sunrise on the 19th of June. I know that is a couple of days before the longest day, but Avebury was to be closed on the 21st, and I thought there might be police stopping people from visiting it that day. So on the 19th of June, I walked through the night, and despite the weather being far from ideal, I loved the experience. As it happened, cloud was going to prevent me from seeing the sunrise or get any decent photographs at Avebury, so I decided to pass the sunrise hour on top of Windmill Hill instead. There is a meeting place or camp on top of this little hill archaeologists call a causewayed enclosure that is more ancient than the Avebury site. In fact, it is one of the oldest man-made sites in the UK, dating from the early Neolithic period. Perhaps this is a good time to refresh your memory. The Neolithic is the final period of the Stone Age, when people started to move away from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle into a more settled way of life, adopting farming practices that had gradually spread from the Middle East across Europe. In about 4000 BC, people in the UK first started farming the land, cultivating crops and rearing animals. This is when our Neolithic period begins. It is the time when the first pottery was produced and when the first monuments, such as long barrows and causewayed enclosures like this one on Windmill Hill, were built. The enclosure on Windmill Hill has 3 concentric rings of deep ditches, indicated by the purple arrows on the aerial photograph, and dates from the early part of that period, from about 3700 BC, and so is over 1,000 years older than the stone monuments of Avebury or Stonehenge. It is believed the early farmers used this enclosure as a meeting place, perhaps at pivotal times of year such as midsummer or midwinter, so it felt right to be there that day. It was while I was sitting on my plastic rug in the early morning drizzle, enjoying sharing my experience with no one but the 6,000-year-old spirits of our ancient ancestors, that I made plans for an even bigger adventure, to walk from my house to Stonehenge for the Winter Solstice, which is what I am going to describe for you today. One night in the London Road Inn, after a pint of Butcombe Original, I mentioned my plans to my friend Clive. Clive was born and bred in Carn and is a few years older than me, and, liking the idea, he asked if I would mind him joining me. He's a good pal, and I was only too happy to agree. For the rest of the summer and autumn, I continued my walks around Carn, venturing further and further afield. Occasionally I would see Clive out stretching his legs in preparation too. The most important part of the planning process, however, was to ensure I had a good route organised for the day, as that was all up to me. Looking at the Ordnance Survey maps, some parts of the routes were obvious, but where there was more than one option, for instance, which path to take off the Marlborough Downs into the Vale of Pewsey, I wanted to make sure I made the best choice. I was also keen to walk the route on the day without having to follow a map, which would also slow us down. So, as the day drew closer, I went out on several missions to check the route. The only place I knew I had to include was the village of Marden in the middle of the Pewsey Vale, and I will explain more about why later. There also happens to be an excellent pub in Marden called the Millstream, where I thought we could meet our families for a good lunch, as it would be about halfway into our journey. And so the day arrives, the 19th of December 2020. We meet outside the London Road Inn at 7:30, with the sky already lightening a little in the east. The weather forecast isn't great, so we both have waterproof jackets on. Clive's is a luminous yellow works jacket, which I worry might scupper our chances of seeing much wildlife. He is also wearing waterproof trousers, while I had decided just to wear my normal light walking trousers. At one point during planning, I had expected to be wearing several layers, because it would be mid-December, but the morning is remarkably warm and leggings aren't necessary. We set off with purpose, striding south down the London road towards Quimmerford. Originally I had hoped to take the path around the back of Blacklands, but I knew it was extremely boggy after a lot of recent rain, so the main road was the best option now. Soon we turn off to pass the lovely old church of St. Peter's and join up with the track. We scurry across the Carnter Devizes Road, thankful at this point for Clive's bright jacket, and turn up the lane towards Calstone. Clive used to work these lanes as a postman and tells me that Calstone was known as the Colours Village because of the abundance of surnames such as White, Brown and Green in the village. We followed the undulating lane until we reached tiny St. Mary's Church and turn right to begin our climb up Morgan's Hill. The path takes us round the edge of fields and then up the side of Horsecombe Bottom, gradually steepening all the while. As we near the top, I find myself apologising for my route. Clive is breathing heavily, and for both of us, our legs are feeling the effects. This is, however, I explain, the toughest part of the walk. We have a short break to look back down onto Carn, and the coffee flask comes out. A rainbow frames the way we have come, and we soon get our breath back. We are at a site of considerable historic interest, a real meeting of ways. We are standing on the old Roman road, which led from Bath to London, and ahead of us the ancient Wansdyke climbs to the summit of the hill. No one knows the exact date or purpose of this massive ditch and bank, but it dates from some time in the so-called Dark Ages after the Romans left the UK. The ditch and bank snakes over the downs to Savernake Forest, staying north of the escarpment that forms the northern edge of the Pewsey Vale. The ditch is to the north of the bank, so was dug to protect against people attacking from that direction, whether they were Mercian Saxons, who were often at war with the Wessex Saxons, or later Viking hordes. After our break, we follow the designated Wansdyke path for a few miles, up over Morgan's Hill, where in the early 18th century a young man, John Morgan, was hanged for having allegedly murdered his uncle. Then down to cross the Avebury to Devizes Road at Shepherd's Shaw Farm, and back up to reach the high hills of the southern Marlborough Downs. The views are magnificent, but there are dark clouds behind us to the south and west, a sign perhaps of things to come. Up here we are surrounded by ancient sites, long barrows from the early Neolithic, round barrows from the Bronze Age, and many undated earthworks whose purpose is long forgotten. It has been suggested that the long barrows marked the edge of tribal territories, Some of them, like West Kennet Longbarrow, have stone chambers and contain human burials, but others are just made of turf, earth and chalk, with no burials inside. Most Wiltshire folk know of West Kennet Longbarrow, but there are a great many more Longbarrows in Wiltshire, clustered especially on the Marlborough Downs, on Salisbury Plain and on Cranbourne Chase, the high chalk expanses of the county. On our walk this morning, we have already passed within a mile or two of 10 of the group of 27 that could be found within 5 miles of Avebury. One such Longbarrow, which may or may not have had stone chambers, looks down on the Pewsey Vale from Kitchenbarrow Hill, and it is here that our route leaves the Wansdyke and drops down into the valley. It is time for elevenses, and to my great delight, Clive produces half a lardy cake from his knapsack. Wiltshire is of course famous for its pork products. As a child I was fascinated and slightly scared by the enormous Harris factory that dominated Calne Town Centre until it was demolished in 1984. At its peak, the factory processed 5,000 pigs each week, producing 100 tonnes of meat pies, 150 tonnes of sausages, 50 tonnes of cooked meats, and 70 tonnes of canned and miscellaneous products. Lardy cake is a pork byproduct. Rendered pork fat is mixed with flour, sugar, dried fruit and spices to make a sticky, moist, sweet bread. I can't imagine anything tasting better with a hot coffee on top of the Marlborough Downs in winter. Our route now takes us down a steep, sunken track to the valley floor. When I recce'd the route a month earlier, the track had been very slippery and deeply rutted. It was hard to negotiate. So when I got to the bottom and noticed what looked like a footpath running along the bank's top, I made a mental note to look for that at the top of the hill on the day itself. As I find the paths beginning today, I feel confident that this will get us to the bottom without having to use the slippery track. However, it soon becomes evident that my confidence is misplaced. The footpath was evidently created by an animal much smaller than Clive or myself, a fox or muntjac perhaps. The path at times leads directly between interlocking blackthorn bushes, whose leafless branches are ferociously armed with 3 to 4 inch thorns, sturdy enough to puncture a rhino's hide. We find that the only way through these thickets is by reversing to protect our hands and eyes, hoping there aren't any surprise animal burrows to stumble back into. Miraculously, we both arrived safely at the bottom without scratches, our clothing somehow intact as well. Perhaps the slippery track would have been a better option after all. As we follow the farm track away from the hills and turn left at some large barns, we realise that the dark clouds we had noted earlier are undoubtedly heading our way. It isn't long before the wind picks up dramatically, followed very quickly by torrential rain that lashes into us from behind. Clive's outfit, strange as it may look, does a wonderful job of keeping him dry, but within moments I am soaked to the skin from the waist down. Remembering that I will be seeing my wife in a couple of hours for lunch, I give her a quick call on my mobile phone and put in a request for some dry clothing. For now, though, I must plod on, wet as I am. Our route takes us past Allington, towards the Kennet and Avon Canal. But before we cross, we have a quick look into the next field, where I know there is one of Wiltshire's many surprises. In 2014, Tim Dorr, a local farmer, built himself a long barrow in the early Neolithic style, complete with stone chambers at its eastern end, as was the tradition. Built like this, the rising sun lights up the interior, particularly on the equinox dawns, when the sun rises due east. On his website he explains that it has internal chambers with niches for cremated remains in urns to be kept. He advertised it as a burial place, and within no time at all the niches had been reserved. And so the ancient local tradition of long barrow burial continues into the modern age. We now cross the lovely Kennet and Avon Canal, all quiet at this time of year, and walk on through All Cannings. Our route into the heart of the Pewsey Vale takes us through level fields, past Stanton Dairy Farm, across the railway, and into the village of Beechingstoke. We don't have far to go now before lunch, and I think it is the time to explain why I particularly wanted our route to go via the village of Marden. It is because there is an enormous late Stone Age monument on the edge of the village of a type that archaeologists call a henge. The vast majority of people have never heard of Marden Henge, even those that live within walking distance. And yet, this huge site must have once been a very important place. There isn't a lot to see here now, but there is enough to get an idea of the scale of this great monument, and it is huge. As at Avebury, a few miles north of here, an enormous bank and ditch surrounds an open flat area, although at Marden there aren't any standing stones, as there are famously at Avebury. Like Avebury, however, the ditch is located inside the bank, so that approaching the monument you reach the bank first. It is this arrangement that defines a henge monument, which is understood to be an enclosed area intended for ceremonial use. Let me explain the reasoning behind this. If you are going to build a defensive structure, such as the Wansdyke we walked beside earlier, you would put the ditch on the outside of the bank as an obstacle for any attackers to overcome before they had to clamber up the bank. Henges are built the other way round, with the ditch on the inside, as if they are trying to keep something in, not keep something out. They are unique to the UK, and there are hundreds of them here, although they vary enormously in size. Some are only a few metres in diameter, but a few, like Avebury and Marden, are massive. In fact, Marden Henge is even bigger than Avebury, being over 500 metres across when measured from north to south. The area enclosed is about 35 acres, which the author Aubrey Burl points out is as capacious as a car park for 16,000 vehicles. There are no stone circles here, but there was once a huge mound inside the enclosure that rose to about 30 foot, which is about a third of the size of Silbury Hill. Unfortunately, it was demolished at the beginning of the 19th century. There was also a second smaller henge within the enclosure and a couple of other unexcavated structures. All of this dates from the late Neolithic, about 2500 to 2400 BC, and is therefore contemporary with Stonehenge and Avebury. As with so many monuments from this period, we don't know exactly what went on here in Marden, but it does lie close to the source of the River Avon, which actually forms the southern boundary of the enclosure. This river goes on to run past another massive henge at Durrington Walls, which, by the way, is our destination today, and then on past Stonehenge itself, so it is very likely that the ceremonies involved the river. Since 2010, English Heritage and Reading University have focused a lot of attention on Marden Henge and other monuments in this area. From 2015, I was fortunate to be involved in 3 years of excavations in and around Marden with Reading University's Archaeology Department, under the direction of Jim Leary and Amanda Clark. So it is a particularly special place for me. After having a good look around, Clive and I head off through the village towards the Millstream pub. My 7-year-old son sees us coming and runs to meet us before showing us the way in to where our partners are sitting at 2 tables, separated due to COVID restrictions. It is very quiet inside, with only 2 other tables occupied, but a log fire burns welcomingly in the hearth. When the menus arrive, I have no hesitation knowing what to order, and I will tell you why. When excavating the henge downriver at Durrington Walls, the archaeologists found huge amounts of animal bones left from massive feasts held there in the Neolithic. The bones mainly came from piglets of about 9 months of age, and since they would have been born in the spring, they must have been eaten during a winter feast. Leaping out at me from the pub menu is pork medallions in a cream and mustard sauce, perfectly appropriate for my midwinter feast. I had a smile on my face when I heard Clive on the table behind me order the same. Lunch is extremely pleasant, and we pass rather too long enjoying the rest and the company, and an extra half pint of Wadworth 6X. Eventually we leave and head off towards Salisbury Plain. We are soon climbing up out of the Pewsey Vale, pleased with our progress, but aware that we won't now make it to Durrington before it gets dark. Our route takes us southeast along the perimeter path. It is called a plain for a reason, and walking is quite hard going when you can see the track heading relentlessly into the distance. As we pass the Iron Age site of Casterly Camp, I notice two important things. That the day is drawing to a close, but, more importantly, that Clive is similarly slowing down. We come off the plain at the hamlet of Compton, and for the first time the light makes us struggle to find our way. I hadn't reckoned this part of the route, but was relying on a newly designated trail called the Great Stones Way being well marked, because that is what I intended to follow for the rest of the day. We do find our way again soon enough, but I'm really starting to worry about Clive, who is visibly struggling, and we still have some miles to go. We cross the road and then the river into Enford and begin walking the lane towards the Swan Inn, with its sign hung high across the road. I've pulled a little ahead of Clive, and as I pass under the sign, a stout man in a wax coat and hat, possibly the landlord, comments, "It's a bit late to be out walking." I look at my watch. It's 5:10 in the afternoon. Not sure how to reply to this, I mumble some sort of vague agreement and continue, wondering what words of wisdom he might have for Clive as he shuffles along some way behind me. It soon becomes evident that Clive won't be able to continue much longer. At one point in the planning, I had hoped to stop at the Swan for refreshment, and in doing so we could have ordered a taxi for Clive. But, due again to COVID, it is shut, and I realise he will have to continue a little longer. The next mile and a half is slow going, and painful for Clive, but eventually we make it to the bus stop at Fifield, and, amazingly, within 5 minutes the X5 bound for Durrington emerges out of the darkness. I'm sorry to see Clive go, and he is disappointed not to be able to complete the walk. But I must now march on if I am going to make our rearranged rendezvous in Durrington this evening. For the next 5 miles I follow the Avon south, sometimes on roads and at other times on vague paths through Riverside fields. It is dark, but it's dry and calm, and I have a good torch. On the way I pass the Stonehenge Brewery in Netheravon, which spurs me on despite my legs starting to tire. The houses of Faldene and Ablington are lit prettily with sparkly Christmas lights, which remind me of the time of year and the festivities ahead. At one point, the Great Stones Way leads me along an extraordinarily muddy stretch of lane, where one full step will see me calf deep in cold mud. And yes, it happens more than once. But then, at the village of Brigmerston, I turn right down a lane past some thatched cottages and cross the river on a metal footbridge. Once over, I'm in the outskirts of Durrington, and my pace quickens again as I march past Avon College and up the hill. This last stretch feels interminable, but at last my destination shows itself on the hilltop. Not Stonehenge itself, of course, but the Stonehenge Inn, where yesterday we had parked our cars. Clive is there waiting for me, having had an interesting bus journey, but apparently visited every village and hamlet, making a journey that would have taken 10 minutes in a car last over an hour. The good news is that they have kept our table for us, despite us being an hour and a half late. Due to COVID, once again, we have to sit outside in their temporary marquee. But there is a heater, and food and drink soon arrive. My drink being a pint of IPA from the Stonehenge Inn brewery I passed an hour or so ago. Our companions are a fairly rowdy but good-humoured lot, holding their socially distanced Christmas party. But at 9:30 the pub takes last orders, and at 10 everyone has to leave. We don't have far to go, as we are going to camp in our cars overnight, which is, fortunately, a very warm one for December. The next day we get up early, because the plan is to get to Stonehenge for daybreak. We are joined by Matt, another regular from the London Road Inn in Calne, and his Welsh colleague Hez. With a slightly stiff spring in our step, we set off for our ultimate destination, which lies about 3 miles away. Shortly we are passing through Durrington Walls, the other enormous Henge Monument that lies on our route. This site was the main focus of the Stonehenge Riverside project between 2003 and 2009. This project involved many of the leading archaeologists of the day, who between them conducted 45 separate excavations in those 7 years. One of the main aims of the project, as the title Stonehenge Riverside Project suggests, was to discover what role Durrington Walls played in the Stonehenge landscape and whether its riverside setting was important. Not only did they discover a wide pathway leading from the Henge to the river, but they also completely unexpectedly discovered the sites of several incredibly rare Neolithic houses, part of a huge village that remains buried under the turf. It was in between these little round houses that rubbish heaps were discovered, full of feasting debris, including thousands of animal bones, mainly from young pigs, which demonstrates, by the way, that Wiltshire's association with pigs goes back a lot further than Lardy Cake and the Harris brothers of Calne. The reckoning was that these feasts had involved thousands of people, and radiocarbon dates extracted from the bones reveal that all this activity was contemporary with the main building event at Stonehenge. Discovering that the remains were of midwinter feasts, as I mentioned at lunchtime, has for most of us completely changed our understanding of Stonehenge. Since the 1970s, thousands of people from around the world have gathered at Stonehenge to celebrate the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, on or near the 21st of June. But this new evidence suggests that to the builders of Stonehenge, summer wasn't the most important time of year, midwinter was. Remarkably, using enamel taken from the teeth of pigs and cows excavated from the site, the archaeologists also discovered that the animals had been brought to the feast from all over Britain. Tooth enamel includes a chemical signature which, and I find this amazing science, reveals the geology of the land where that animal was reared. And some of the animals consumed here must have been reared at least 180 miles away, and possibly as far away as Scotland. So you could interpret this as a sort of Neolithic bring-a-pig party. These festival goers didn't have horses and hadn't yet invented the wheel, so, like us, they had to travel on foot. This was the experience I wanted to share with my ancestors. An arrival at Durrington and Stonehenge for the midwinter solstice. And here we are now, following in those ancient footsteps for the last couple of miles as the sun starts to lighten the sky. Modern day Druids do gather at Stonehenge for midwinter, as well as midsummer and the equinox dawns, but there are only a handful of us others here today. Because of COVID, only those who claim a religious connection to Stonehenge are to be allowed within the stone circle today, and it is only to be a select few of them. The sun is due to rise at 8 minutes past 8, and just before the hour, a minibus comes down the lane from the visitor centre, parks at the bus stop, and a group of 12 men and women climb down. Most are dressed in long robes or gowns, with heavy cloaks thrown over their shoulders and clasped at the throat. Some are more simply attired in plain white robes belted around the middle. All, however, are carrying something, whether that be a staff, a ceremonial sword, or a basket of offerings. They walk towards the stones in a line, chatting and smiling, while we watch on from behind the boundary rope. As we watch the sunrise, I just want to mention one more thing. The reason there has been a confusion over Stonehenge's relevance in the calendar is because actions of both the winter sun and the summer sun align with the main axis of Stonehenge. In midsummer, the sun famously rises on the horizon behind the hillstone. But in midwinter, it is the setting sun that is important, which goes down directly behind the tallest stones, the central pair of the inner horseshoe. This creates an extraordinary shadow effect, the stone's shadows lengthening past the hailstone and down the Stonehenge Avenue, eventually stretching to an incredible distance as the sun sets. Where the shadows stop, the avenue turns and leads over the ridge to the River Avon, the river again presumably playing a major role in any ceremonies. "So I suppose we should wait here till sunset then," remarks Clive, and with a good laugh we all set off back towards our cars. Maybe next time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation on behalf of Celebrating Age Wiltshire. Once again, I'm Laurence of Oldbury Tours. Goodbye.